time to look at the Space Marines who arrange all the books. Hello again and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy-focused 40k channel, where we're looking to get the most out of all of our miniatures on the tabletop. Today we'll be continuing in our look at the various options in the new Space Marine Codex, and we've reached the Librarians. Quite a complicated HQ choice that can be fielded in a number of different ways, and has a ridiculous amount of options now we have individual spells from all of the supplement books. In this review we'll take a quick look at the various Librarian datasheets that we have in Codex Space Marines, some of the various spells open to them, both in this book and supplements, and certain ways that I would run them on the tabletop. In the background, the Librarians are the psychic-wielding Space Marines, who must both endure the brutal physical training regime that their chapter has to offer, and must also reshape their mind into a weapon of war to be used against the foes of the Emperor. In battle, they can conjure deadly bolts of energy from the warp, manipulate time to give their battle brothers the edge in a combat situation, or heal or repair their Space Marine allies who have sustained battle damage. In addition to their fearsome combat role, the Librarians and the Librarius is the organisation that chronicles the chapter's history. As we can see, this guy here is quite proudly displaying his book, probably trying to entice his fellow battle brothers to read a bit more. So let's see what these psychic-wielding champions can do for your army on the battlefield, and let's take a look at their datasheets. So there are 4 different types of Space Marine Librarians that can be fielded from Codex Space Marines. These are the Standard Librarian, who can be fielded on foot or with a jump pack, the Primaris Librarian, the Librarian in Terminator armour, the Phobos Librarian, as now either in the Index or in Warhammer Legends is the Librarian on bike. So let's take a quick look at their various merits. Firstly, your Standard Librarian is an HQ choice for Codex Space Marines, and at base he will cost you 88 points when armed with a Force Stave. He's got a typical Space Marine supporting character stat line with Movement 6, Weapon Skill and Ballistic Skill 3 up, Strength and Toughness 4, 4 wounds, 3 attacks, Leadership 9 and a 3 up save. At base he's armed with a Force Stave, which is Strength +2, AP -1 and D3 damage, though we can swap this out for a Force Sword for the same amount, or a Force Axe for 2 extra points, making him 90 points. They're basically equivalents of Power Swords and Power Axes with D3 damage, making him reasonably handy in close combat. In all honesty, I think that these options are all fairly well balanced. It just depends on whether you want him to be a little bit stronger and a little less AP, or less strong with more AP. I could happily take any of them, but in general I wouldn't usually recommend getting your Librarian stuck into the heart of the action, as they aren't really all that durable. Besides this, he's armed with a bolt pistol and frag and crack grenades. You can swap out the bolt pistol for a combi weapon, bolter, or a weapon from the pistols list. Of all of these options, I'd be most tempted by the Storm Bolter, as 2 points for a bunch of extra shots never did anyone any harm. Finally, you can opt to take a jump pack for this guy, and this will cost you an extra 28 points, so it's really quite a hefty investment over your Standard Librarian. It'll put him at 116 points base cost. Extra movement is great, but when it gets to this amount of extra points cost, I would seriously consider whether or not he really needs it. One of the best applications of a jump pack is that it will let him deep strike and come in from reserve to support some units, although bear in mind that the Terminator Librarian can do this too. This guy has Angels of Death, giving him Shock Assault for a little bit of extra close combat prowess, Combat Doctrines, which is only mainly going to help him in the Assault Doctrine, though a little bit of extra AP if you do give him a Storm Bolter isn't a bad shout in Tactical Doctrine, and Bolter Discipline, which might help him out if he is holding a Bolter or Storm Bolter. Besides this, he has the Psychic Hood special rule, which gives you +1 to his Denial ability if the enemy casts a Psychic power within 12 inches of him. Talking of Psychic powers, he knows 2 from the Librarius discipline, as well as Smite. He can attempt to cast 2 powers a turn, and can attempt to deny 1 power a turn. Of course, for various supplements or the other major chapters, they all have their own Psychic disciplines, which either replace the Librarius discipline, or can be swapped out in addition to it in the case of the supplement books to Codex Space Marines, but we'll come on to those in a second. So this guy is your fairly basic Librarian, and I sort of see the others as all upgrades to him in various ways. Next we have the Primaris Librarian, who is very simply essentially exactly the same, but costs a bit more and has less options. He costs 98 points rather than the Standard Librarian's 88, and can only take a Force Sword and Bolt Pistol. For that extra 10 points you do get an additional wound and attack, so it's a little bit more durable and a little bit more fighty, but typically the main value of the Librarian is his psychic powers, and he doesn't really do any more than the main Librarian. I'd say from a purely competitive standpoint it's usually going to be better to take the regular Librarian, but the Primaris Librarian does have a very cool model, and he does have some other advantages, such as being able to get inside Primaris transports, which could be useful. Next up we have the Librarian in Terminator armor, who will cost you another further 10 points increase, so he clocks in at 108 points. For this extra investment over the standard Librarian you get an extra wound, so he's 5 wounds again, but only 3 attacks. He has the 2-up save for being in Terminator armor, and a 5-up invul from the Crux Terminatus, but his movement does drop to 5. As we mentioned earlier, he has the Deep Strike ability to set up in reserve and come in to support other units, so he is very tempting to take over the Jump Pack Librarian, because he costs less points and is significantly more survivable. In terms of war gear, at base this guy is just armed with a Force Stave, but you can take a weapon from the Terminator combi weapons list. Again, I'm a big fan of the Stormbolter for cheap extra firepower, though you could give him a fancy gun if you'd like to. So 20 points more expensive, tougher, and with Deep Strike compared with your standard Librarian. Next we have the Librarian in Phobos armor, which I have covered in a video all to himself, where we go over the Obscuration discipline. He is very similar to the Primaris Librarian in statline, but has the added advantage of having a camo cloak, making him a little bit tougher when he's in cover. His other big advantage is concealed positions, allowing him to set up outside of his own deployment zone if needed, and maybe support infiltrating Phobos units or other units with similar rules like Scouts or Invicta Tactical Warsuits. I believe he cannot take the Librarius discipline instead of Obscuration, but he can swap this out for any of the supplement specific spells, meaning that he is quite flexible still. Now this guy costs 101 points, so he's only 3 points more than your standard Primaris Librarian, and I think that for the camo cloak and the forward deployment option that's usually going to be worth it. Obviously if you don't want the Librarius discipline and are instead using one of the chapter specific disciplines, or Obscuration. If you'd like to hear more thoughts on Obscuration then please watch my Phobos Librarian video. I'm not going to go over it here again. In this one we're going to focus on the Librarius discipline. Finally we have the Index/Legends option, the Librarian on bike, who will set you back 129 points in total, so is the most expensive of the lot. The bike gives him +1 wound, +1 toughness, and a massive 14-inch movement, which increases to 20 if you advance. So if you are using these options, he is certainly a very fast and reasonably tough Librarian. He also comes with the twin bolters on the bike, so a little shooting output as well. So overall, your choice of Librarian depends on what you want him to do. Personally, I do feel that the standard Librarian and the Phobos Librarian basically overshadow the standard Primaris Librarian quite a bit, if we're talking for a 100% points efficiency type point of view. The mobile Librarians are really quite expensive with the jump pack and the bike. They really do pay a premium for that added mobility, so I would typically try and field them on foot if I could. But obviously this would depend on whether or not I needed them to be mobile for whichever strategy I was planning on using them for. For deep striking Librarians, it's essentially your choice whether or not you want a more heavily armoured Librarian deployed to the front lines, or you want the mobility of the jump pack after he has dropped. Both are decently valid options for a support Librarian coming in from reserve. And finally we've got the Phobos Librarian for early pressure and upfront psychic, particularly if you're supporting Phobos units with the Obscuration discipline. So let's take a quick look through the powers and options available. I've decided for this video, seeing as we've got quite a lot to cover, we're just going to focus on the Librarius powers themselves, and I'll do another video in a day or two's time, where we'll go through the Codex specific spells and relics available to Librarians. So what does the Librarius discipline have to offer us? Firstly, we have Veil of Time. This has a warp charge of 6 and a range of 18 inches. You cast it on one of your chapter units and they can re-roll the dice for advance and charge rolls, and if they're in the fight phase then they always strike first unless the enemy unit has charged. I personally feel the strongest application for this one is supporting a unit that's charging out of Deep Strike, though it is a little bit unreliable if you do need this reroll to have it on a power that you could fail or could be denied. It's not one of the strongest in my opinion, but I could see niche uses for it. Next up we have Might of Heroes, which is solid. You pick a friendly chapter model within 12 inches of the psyker, and if you pass your spell on a warp charge of 6, then you add 1 to its strength, attacks and toughness characteristics. So this is a really reasonable buff, particularly on a fighty character. The way I've often seen this used is, say, if you have a fighty smash captain with a power fist or thunderhammer about to charge the enemy, the Librarian will charge up that character, so he could be hitting on strength 10 with 6 attacks on the charge with shock assault, and he'll also be hard to take down in return. You could also use this on the Librarian himself in a pinch to turn him from a modest close combat threat to someone who's considerably more scary. You could also use this on a vehicle, mainly for the toughness benefit, particularly if you've got a toughness 7 or toughness 8 vehicle, then gaining +1 toughness for a turn could be incredibly useful. If you're toughness 7, then it'll really help you withstand strength 7 or 8 firepower, which there's quite a lot of going about in Warhammer 40k. And if you're toughness 8 going to toughness 9, you'll have things like missile launchers and melter guns wounding you on 5s, and las cannons only wounding you on 4s, so it could be great on, say, a Land Raider or Repulsor, for example. You could have the best of both worlds if you use this on a Dreadnought, say a Redemptor Dreadnought, where he'd be able to be toughness 8 and a fair bit harder to kill, and also make use of that extra attack and strength. So I really like this power. It's probably the strongest of the Librarius discipline, in my opinion, besides perhaps our next offering anyway. Next up we have Null Zone. Null Zone is a Warp Charge 7 power that only has a range of 6 inches, but the effect is powerful. While they're within those 6 inches, enemy units cannot use invulnerable saves, and if they take a psychic test, then they must have the result of the roll rounding up. Now this is very powerful in the right situation. A lot of units get their primary defensive bonus out of an invul save, whether it's various Space Marine units with Storm Shields, Imperial Knights with Rotate Ion Shields, Thousand Suns Demon Princes, demons of virtually any sort like Plague Bearers, the list goes on and on. Being able to slingshot a Librarian up the board and to take that invul save out of the equation, ready for the rest of your army to light up the unit in question, is a really powerful ability. I think this one's best used on a Librarian with additional movement capability, so a jump pack or bike, because the power has such a short range that you really need to be sure that you're going to be able to get the Librarian where they need to be. This could certainly be a game-changing power if it goes off at the right moment, and could let you topple a few powerful enemy units for virtually no firepower invested. However, it does have problems. As we've said, the range is quite short, meaning that you might not easily be able to get in range, and also the Librarian would have to be right at the front of your army, right next to whichever scary threat it is that you want to delete. This could easily put them at risk of reprisals, and Librarians really aren't that tough to remove from the game with a little bit of firepower. So a tricky spell to use, but certainly could be worth picking up to have in the toolbox against armies that rely on big invul saves. Next up we have Psychic Scourge, which is Warp Charge 6 and 18-inch range. This is sort of a targeted smite, where if you pass the psychic test, you have to roll a dice, add your leadership, when your opponent does the same for their leadership, and if you get higher you get D3 mortal wounds, if you get the same you get 1, and if you get less you get none. In general this is going to be flat weaker than Smite, as it's got a lot higher chance of failing, but it could be useful to, say, trim off the last wound off a character who you'd otherwise not be able to target, or just add to the barrage of mortal wounds a psychic can put out if you're combining it with Smite. Fifth on the list we have Fury of the Ancients. This is a Warp Charge 7 power with a 12-inch range. You select one enemy model and you draw a line immediately between the Librarian's base and their base. For every enemy unit that has a model in it that crosses this line, they all suffer 1 mortal wound. I think that the idea that they're going for here is to be able to spear multiple units with 1 attack, but honestly I think that this is really hard to position, and even if the stars do align and you skewer multiple enemy units, it's not got all the highest damage output and puts your Librarian again at risk of enemy reprisals. I honestly wouldn't take this one, it's not really all that good. Finally we have Psychic Fortress, which is a Warp Charge 5 power that targets one of your own friendly units within 18 inches. Until the start of the next phase, you don't have to roll morale for that unit, they just automatically pass, and if they suffer a mortal wound from the enemy's psychic phase, then they ignore the mortal wound on a 4-up. This one could be useful against a very psychic heavy army, say if you're facing off against a Zench army with a whole ton of sorcerers ready to cast Smite in your face. It could well be worth putting this on the unit that's furthest forward, and therefore it's going to eat a lot of mortal wounds. Other than that though, it's not really all that powerful. I would save it as one just to pick in if you are facing off against that sort of army. So that's the Librarius discipline then. Overall my favourites are Null Zone and Might of Heroes, and the others are only a bit more situational, or don't quite have that strong effects. So let's take a quick look at relics and stratagems now. So looking at the Relic section from the main Space Marine Codex, a few options stand out. First of all, we have the Armor Indomitus to give you a 2-up armor save and once per game a 3-up invul save to keep you safe. This could easily allow the Librarian to live one extra turn, and another turn of Psychic Mastery could have a decent effect on the game. The Reliquary of Gethalamor is an option that can be used to combine with your Denial powers to help prevent enemy units from casting spells. This one is a Primaris only one, and it means that enemy units subtract 1 from the casting value when they roll to make a psychic test, and if they fail to cast a power, then on a 4+, they also take D3 mortal wounds. So with that, you're going to be able to create a very decent bubble where the enemy isn't really going to want to cast any spells between this Relic's effects and your own Denial ability. Next we have the Ghostweave Cloak, which is for the Phobos Librarian, and it basically means that enemy attacks will have -1 to wound against him, which is a very decent survivability buff. Finally, we have the Tome of Malkador, which is a potentially useful pick. It's Librarian models only and allows the Librarian to know 1 additional spell from any discipline they have access to. So the best use of this one is to gain one of the Codex specific spells if you're using Librarius discipline as your main one, or vice versa. If you want to use one of the Codex specific disciplines, it could let you pick up one of the Librarius discipline spells such as Might of Heroes or Null Zone. This is pretty much the single relic that I would consider best on Space Marine Librarians, as it could allow you to cast your most powerful Codex specific spell as well as Null Zone or Might of Heroes if they're also good parts of your strategy. Finally, as with all of the supplement books, you can choose to mastercraft a weapon. So if you really were trying to build a fighty Librarian, either with Might of Heroes or some of the self-buffing powers from the Codexes, you could use this to give yourself an extra pip of damage on your force weapon. In terms of stratagems, probably the biggest uses of the Librarian stratagems are going to be command rerolls for Psychic and Denial tests, which will be best judged on a case-by-case basis as to how valuable the spell is to cast or deny, compared with how likely you are to make that cast or deny by re-rolling one of the dice. Other than this, you can consider only in Death Does Duty End to fight when you die, or on another chapter to fight again in the fight phase, if either of these are crucial to dragging down your Librarian's close combat opponent. Librarians aren't really quite as fighty as tooled up captains, but they could put a decent dent in the enemy if it was absolutely necessary. Finally, you can also use transhuman physiology to give your Librarian every chance of surviving some heavy weapons fire, but it is quite a lot of command points, and there is a reasonable chance they might well just die anyway. They really aren't that tough. There is a successor chapter trait that does help out Librarians called Knowledge is Power. This one basically allows you to reroll any rolls of 1 for casts or denies with your Librarian. And if you are going on a Librarian heavy strategy, it could well be worth picking up. My main problem with this trait is that it doesn't help out any of the other units in your force aside from the Librarians themselves, and I usually feel a more general buff will help you out more than this. Finally, in terms of warlord traits from the main Space Marine book, the Imperium's sword isn't so terrible if you are trying to go down the route of a fighty Librarian, or Iron Resolve could make them more durable. Though I will be typically tending to put this on other units that aren't Librarians, because they'll often get more value out of them with better close combat profiles. So how would I run a Librarian on the battlefield? We've already talked about the various merits of the different Librarians, so I won't reiterate that here, but once you've chosen your Librarian, you'd have to decide which powers you're going to be using game on game. You don't have to declare them on your army list, so they are powers that you can choose after you've seen your opponent's army. I would weigh up whether you want to take the powers from your own Codex supplement compared with the standard Librarius powers each game, as that could be quite a crucial decision, and you can always think to buy in the Tome of Malkador with the pre-game Relics stratagem if you absolutely desperately need options from both disciplines. From the Librarius discipline, the only actual spell that I would actually build around is Might of Heroes. I'd be very tempted to run a Librarian either on foot or with one of the mobility options to run alongside a fighty character. Maybe a standard Smash Captain with a Thunderhammer, or perhaps some sort of snazzy special character from one of the supplement books, which could be anything from Kavan Shrike to Rarute Gilliman. I'd ideally want him to be loitering just behind this character, handing out that buff and smiting away, while trying not to expose himself so much that he's going to get himself killed. I'd certainly be wary about sniper fire and being exposed to enemy close combat or shooting, and try and avoid combat where you can. If you're either heavily winning the game or heavily losing the game though, I think about committing your Librarian to the fight and look for opportunities to charge. as you may either not really need that psychic buff anymore and the extra damage could be more useful, or you're in the situation where you need to absolutely get some big swings to get yourself back in the game, and committing every ounce of melee combat to the battle could be what's needed. I could absolutely see a Librarian being part of a general character buffing bubble, run alongside chaplains, captains, lieutenants, apothecaries and the like, to both give and receive buffs from his fellow characters. One thing to consider in the positioning of Librarians is to always think about enemy denials, and if you do have the option of loitering just outside their 24-inch denial bubble from their psyker, then you should absolutely do it, because otherwise you're just giving the enemy free chances to get in the way of your spells. So do Librarians make the cut to be leaders that you want to take over the many solid options that Space Marines have as HQ choices? Personally, I do feel that they struggle a bit compared with the rest, mainly because they have the chance to either fail their buffs or to have them denied by enemy psykers, which really is quite a big drawback. The buffs and powers need to be really quite powerful to justify their inclusion, if they aren't absolutely certain to go off. In general, I think I would only personally use a Librarian myself if I had a specific strategy that I was building around, and for the most part that would generally mean using some of the other psychic powers in the supplement books, and maybe thinking of throwing the Librarius in, say if I did really want Null Zone or Might of Heroes against a certain opponent. Some of these supplement book options are really solid indeed, and seeing as this video's already gone on for quite some time already, I think we'll leave them till next time. So check back in a couple of days where we'll come back for part 2 of this review, where we'll look at chapter specific Librarian options. Feel free to let me know any thoughts about Librarians in general, and particularly any powers from the Librarius discipline. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more videos like this, or to support me on Patreon if you're finding my content enjoyable. Thanks very much for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.